about building a future-ready nation. Our today has a strong foundation with community at its core. Our today is dedicated to the communities we serve. Today is always about more than just today. Our today is a continuous journey for a better tomorrow. Tata, leadership with trust.
सर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। साहब, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। हुजूर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान।
अपनों को खुशियां दिलाना आसान नहीं बनाते तो आगे कैसे बढ़ते। इसीलिए हम जो भी करते हैं उसे बेहतर बनाते आ रहे हैं, बनाते रहेंगे। बजाज फिनसर्व, थिंक इट डन।
आने वाले कल की दस्तक हमें सुनाई देती है, नई मंजिल है जिस ओर हमें वो दिशा दिखाई देती है। नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए जोश से निकल पड़े हम, आने वाला कल होगा हमारा। नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
और नए इंडिया के इस सफर में टेक्नोलॉजी की शक्ति लेकर आपका भागीदार रहेगा रिलायंस। रिलायंस, नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
Welcome to the world of Tata Steel, a flagship company of the global business conglomerate, the Tata Group. Tata Steel is one of the world's most geographically diversified steel producers, with operations and commercial presence across the world. The story began with the dream of one man, Jamsetji Nusserwanji Tata, a pioneer, a visionary, a man ahead of his times. He had his heart set on building a steel plant in India that would compare with the best globally. His dream was brought to fruition by his son, Dorabji Tata, and thus was born Tata Iron and Steel in Jamshedpur in 1907. At the turn of the 21st century, fueled by its global aspirations, Tata Steel expanded its footprint to Southeast Asia in Singapore and Thailand. Acquisition of Chorus in Europe in 2007 placed it amongst the top global steel companies in the world. In 2015, Tata Steel set up a state-of-the-art integrated steel plant at Kalinganagar, Odisha in India. The Phase 2 expansion of Kalinganagar steel plant from 3 million TPA to 8 million TPA is currently underway. The company is all set to pursue domestic growth with its acquisition of Bhushan Steel Limited and the steel business of Usha Martin. This forms part of the overall strategy to increase its India footprint, build capacity in long products, and enrich the product portfolio. Besides steel manufacturing facilities, the company is mining assets in the state of Jharkhand and Odisha in India. Tata Steel has evolved into a leading steel manufacturer, catering to diverse market segments. In its trend-setting journey, spanning more than a century, Tata Steel has contributed immensely towards the well-being of the planet and people. Guided by its vision to be the global steel industry benchmark for value creation and corporate citizenship, Tata Steel is poised to lead the future.
सुरक्षा हर पिच पर, ताकत लंबी पारी खेलने की, परफेक्ट फिट, क्वालिटी टेस्ट। मैच से पहले ये सारे चेक्स बहुत जरूरी होते हैं, ठीक वैसे जैसे घर की छत चूज करते समय। तो बस ले आइए GSW कलर ऑन प्लस किचन, जो दे आपके घर को मजबूती और सुरक्षा। GSW कलर ऑन प्लस, सुंदर छत सालों साल।
GSW न्यू स्टील TMT सरिया बेस्ट है।
सरिया दिखता कहाँ है?
ये देखिए बेस्ट क्वालिटी।
चेस्ट गार्ड है, दिखता कहाँ है?
दिखता नहीं तो कुछ भी लगाओगे क्या? ये देना। JSW न्यू स्टील TMT बार, प्योर स्टील, मजबूत घर।
ये दीवारें जानती हैं हर शुरुआत का पता। एक नई सोच के साथ अपने सपने की सुबह।
जब उम्मीद मिलाए हिम्मत से हाथ, हर सपने को मिले मजबूती का साथ।
आओ बनाए हर सपने को मजबूत JSW सीमेंट के साथ। JSW सीमेंट, द लीडर्स चॉइस।
कभी हिंदुस्तान के रंगों के बारे में सोचा है? लाल, पीला, हरा, नीला। तो चलो मिलकर इस रंगीन चादर को फिर से सिलते हैं। जो तेरा वो मेरा, और जो मेरा वो सबका। इसीलिए पहली बार JSW पेंट्स लाए हैं 1808 शेड्स एक ही प्राइस पर। JSW पेंट्स, थिंक ब्यूटीफुल।
In 1868, the Tata Group was founded on a philosophy that put the community at the heart of its existence. Today, we are a $100 billion global enterprise. Our today has been built on enduring values. is about delivering excellence across business sectors. Today is about building a future-ready nation. Our today has a strong foundation with community at its core. Our today is dedicated to the communities we serve. Today is always about more than just today. Our today is a continuous journey for a better tomorrow. Tata, leadership with trust.
सर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। साहब, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। हुजूर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता।
अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान।
अपनों को खुशियां दिलाना आसान नहीं बनाते तो आगे कैसे बढ़ते। इसीलिए हम जो भी करते हैं उसे बेहतर बनाते आ रहे हैं, बनाते रहेंगे। बजाज फिनसर्व, थिंक इट डन।
आने वाले कल की दस्तक हमें सुनाई देती है, नई मंजिल है जिस ओर हमें वो दिशा दिखाई देती है। नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए जोश से निकल पड़े हम, आने वाला कल होगा हमारा। नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
और नए इंडिया के इस सफर में टेक्नोलॉजी की शक्ति लेकर आपका भागीदार रहेगा रिलायंस। रिलायंस, नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
Welcome to the world of Tata Steel, a flagship company of the global business conglomerate, the Tata Group. Tata Steel is one of the world's most geographically diversified steel producers, with operations and commercial presence across the world. The story began with the dream of one man, Jamsetji Nusserwanji Tata, a pioneer, a visionary, a man ahead of his times. He had his heart set on building a steel plant in India that would compare with the best globally. His dream was brought to fruition by his son, Dorabji Tata, and thus was born Tata Iron and Steel in Jamshedpur in 1907. At the turn of the 21st century, fueled by its global aspirations, Tata Steel expanded its footprint to Southeast Asia in Singapore and Thailand. Acquisition of Chorus in Europe in 2007 placed it amongst the top global steel companies in the world. In 2015, Tata Steel set up a state-of-the-art integrated steel plant at Kalinganagar, Odisha in India. The Phase 2 expansion of Kalinganagar steel plant from 3 million TPA to 8 million TPA is currently underway. The company is all set to pursue domestic growth with its acquisition of Bhushan Steel Limited and the steel business of Usha Martin. This forms part of the overall strategy to increase its India footprint, build capacity in long products, and enrich the product portfolio. Besides steel manufacturing facilities, the company has mining assets in the state of Jharkhand and Odisha in India. Tata Steel has evolved into a leading steel manufacturer, catering to diverse market segments. In its trend-setting journey, spanning more than a century, Tata Steel has contributed immensely towards the well-being of the planet and people. Guided by its vision to be the global steel industry benchmark for value creation and corporate citizenship, Tata Steel is poised to lead the future.
सुरक्षा हर पिच पर, ताकत लंबी पारी खेलने की, परफेक्ट फिट, क्वालिटी टेस्ट, मैच से पहले ये सारे चेक्स बहुत जरूरी होते हैं, ठीक वैसे जैसे घर की छत चूज करते समय। तो बस ले आइए GSW कलर ऑन प्लस की छत, जो दे आपके घर को मजबूती और सुरक्षा। GSW कलर ऑन प्लस, सुंदर छत सालों साल।
GSW नियो स्टील TMT सरिया बेस्ट है।
सरिया दिखता कहाँ है?
ये देखिए बेस्ट क्वालिटी।
चेस्ट गार्ड है, दिखता कहाँ है?
दिखता नहीं तो कुछ भी लगाओगे क्या? ये देना। JSW नियो स्टील TMT बार, प्योर स्टील, मजबूत घर।
ये दीवारें जानती हैं हर शुरुआत का पता। एक नई सोच के साथ अपने सपने की सुबह।
जब उम्मीद मिलाए हिम्मत से हाथ, हर सपने को मिले मजबूती का साथ।
आओ बनाए हर सपने को मजबूत JSW सीमेंट के साथ। JSW सीमेंट, द लीडर्स चॉइस।
कभी हिंदुस्तान के रंगों के बारे में सोचा है? लाल, पीला, हरा, नीला। तो चलो मिलकर इस रंगीन चादर को फिर से सिलते हैं। जो तेरा वो मेरा और जो मेरा वो सबका। इसीलिए पहली बार JSW पेंट्स लाए हैं 1808 शेड्स एक ही प्राइस पर। JSW पेंट्स, थिंक ब्यूटीफुल।
In 1868, the Tata Group was founded on a philosophy that put the community at the heart of its existence. Today, we are $100 billion global enterprise. Our today has been built on enduring values. Our today is about delivering excellence across business sectors. Our today is about building a future-ready nation. Our today has a strong foundation with community at its core. Our today is dedicated to the communities we serve. Our today is always about more than just today. Our today is a continuous journey for a better tomorrow. Tata. Leadership with trust.
सर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। साहब, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता। हुजूर, अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान हो ही नहीं सकता।
अपनों को खुश रखना इससे आसान।
अपनों को खुशियां दिलाना आसान नहीं बनाते तो आगे कैसे बढ़ते। इसीलिए हम जो भी करते हैं उसे बेहतर बनाते आ रहे हैं, बनाते रहेंगे। बजाज फिनसर्व, थिंक इट डन।
आने वाले कल की दस्तक हमें सुनाई देती है, उस ओर हमें वो दिशा दिखाई देती है। नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए इंडिया का नया जोश, नए जोश से निकल पड़े हम, आने वाला कल होगा हमारा। नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
और नए इंडिया के इस सफर में टेक्नोलॉजी की शक्ति लेकर आपका भागीदार रहेगा रिलायंस। रिलायंस, नए इंडिया का नया जोश।
Welcome to the world of Tata Steel, a flagship company of the global business conglomerate, the Tata Group. Tata Steel is one of the world's most geographically diversified steel producers, with operations and commercial presence across the world. The story began with the dream of one man, Jamsetji Nusserwanji Tata, a pioneer, a visionary, a man ahead of his times. He had his heart set on building a steel plant in India that would compare with the best globally. His dream was brought to fruition by his son, Dorabji Tata, and thus was born Tata Iron and Steel in Jamshedpur in 1907. At the turn of the 21st century, fueled by its global aspirations, Tata Steel expanded its footprint to Southeast Asia in Singapore and Thailand. Acquisition of Chorus in Europe in 2007 placed it amongst the top global steel companies in the world. In 2015, Tata Steel set up a state-of-the-art integrated steel plant at Kalinganagar, Odisha in India. The Phase 2 expansion of Kalinganagar steel plant from 3 million TPA to 8 million TPA is currently underway. The company is all set to pursue domestic growth with its acquisition of Bhushan Steel Limited and the steel business of Usha Martin. This forms part of the overall strategy to increase its India footprint, build capacity in long products, and enrich the product portfolio. Besides steel manufacturing facilities, the company has mining assets in the state of Jharkhand and Odisha in India. Tata Steel has evolved into a leading steel manufacturer, catering to diverse market segments. In its trend-setting journey, spanning more than a century, Tata Steel has contributed immensely towards the well-being of the planet and people. Guided by its vision to be the global steel industry benchmark for value creation and corporate citizenship, Tata Steel is poised to lead the future.
सुरक्षा हर पिच पर, ताकत लंबी पारी खेलने की, परफेक्ट फिट, क्वालिटी टेस्ट, मैच से पहले ये सारे चेक्स बहुत जरूरी होते हैं, ठीक वैसे जैसे घर की छत चूज करते समय। तो बस ले आइए GSW कलर ऑन प्लस किचन, जो दे आपके घर को मजबूती और सुरक्षा। GSW कलर ऑन प्लस, सुंदर छत सालों साल।
JSW नियो स्टील TMT सरिया बेस्ट है।
सरिया दिखता कहाँ है?
ये देखिए बेस्ट क्वालिटी।
चेस्ट गार्ड है, दिखता कहाँ है?
दिखता नहीं तो कुछ भी लगाओगे क्या? ये देना। JSW नियो स्टील TMT बार, प्योर स्टील मजबूत घर।
ये दीवारें जानती हैं हर शुरुआत का पता। एक नई सोच के साथ अपने सपने की सुबह।
जब उम्मीद मिलाए हिम्मत से हाथ, हर सपने को मिले मजबूती का साथ।
आओ बनाए हर सपने को मजबूत JSW सीमेंट के साथ। JSW सीमेंट, द लीडर्स चॉइस।
कभी हिंदुस्तान के रंगों के बारे में सोचा है? लाल, पीला, हरा, नीला। तो चलो मिलकर इस रंगीन चादर को फिर से सिलते हैं। जो तेरा वो मेरा और जो मेरा वो सबका। इसीलिए पहली बार JSW पेंट्स लाए हैं 1808 शेड्स एक ही प्राइस पर। JSW पेंट्स, थिंक ब्यूटीफुल।
In 1868, the Tata Group was founded on a philosophy that put the community at the heart of its existence. Today, we are $100 billion global enterprise. Our today has been built on enduring values. Our today is about delivering excellence across business sectors. Our today is about building a future-ready nation.
So can I start CII? Can somebody from CII tell me if I can start?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you've joined us from. Welcome to this very, very special session of the 2020 Partnership Summit. We are honored to be joined today by Ambassador Robert Leitesser, the U.S. Trade Representative who has led U.S. trade policy and negotiations for the past 3.5 years. During his tenure, the ambassador has been responsible for securing and restructuring a number of historic trade deals, including the China Phase 1 agreement and the US-Japan agreement, as well as the largest trade deal in US history, the USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. The impressive efforts of both the Indian and the US negotiators under the guidance of Minister Goyal and Ambassador Lighthizer has led us closer to an India-US trade deal, a commendable legacy for both sides as we strive for a mutually advantageous resolution to some long-standing issues and convergence on some emerging areas. The bipartisan support in the US Congress for strong India-US economic relationship and by extension a bilateral trade deal, especially in recent years, has chartered the growth of our trade relationship. Prior to the pandemic, the India-US trade levels were at their highest, reaching about 150 billion in 2019 as the US became India's top trading partner and the US trade deficit with India reduced. Recent major government reforms have transformed the Indian economy into the fastest-growing market for many US industry sectors, and this would continue as India's tech, manufacturing, and pharma sectors take center stage to support public health in the global crisis. Indian investments in the US and their job creation, R&D, and corporate social responsibility outcomes, as well as their support to the US during the pandemic, have also increased. Indian companies are helping contribute within the local US communities where they operate. Ambassador Lighthizer, thank you once again for joining us. We are very keen to hear from you. What have been your perspectives and experiences since you joined till the current scenario that we find ourselves in? How has the US leadership and your priorities on global trade policy changed? And indeed, during your time as US Trade Representative, how have your views on the US-India trade relationship evolved? With that, let me invite you to deliver your remarks, which I'll follow with some questions. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Well, great. Thank you very much, Mr. Nandra. It's a pleasure to be here at the Confederation of Indian Industries. You have a great 125-year tradition. There's not too many things that go on for 125 years, so you must be doing something right. So I'm proud to be here. I'm a great fan of India. I've studied your history, and it's just it's a great story. I should begin by expressing our sympathy to all the Indians as well as others around the world who have suffered from this COVID-19. I'm confident we're going to get out of the way. We'll be stronger as a result of it, but it's been a real burden personally on an awful lot of people I know in India as well as the United States and on industry, and it's had repercussions that'll be felt for many, many years. So I want to just sort of say that to start off with. In terms of India and Indian relations, I mentioned that I have done some study, not a lot, but some study of Indian history, and it's a wonderful history of the things that pop into mind are resilience, for sure, and energy, right? Resilience and energy. So you have an awful lot to be proud of. I know from our point of view as Americans, we find the relationship very, very important. Trade is part of that relationship. There are a lot of other parts of it. Prime Minister Modi and President Trump have a super relationship. They've both worked at it. I've been in the room with both of them many times together. They've had great trips to each other's countries. So I'm very proud of the fact that the relationship overall has developed between the United States and India. And we all know there are a lot of reasons, a lot of obvious economic reasons for us to grow closer. There are a lot of geopolitical reasons why we should grow closer. And the two great democracies, and we have a shared vision of the world. We have a shared vision of what economy should be like. So it's important that the United States and India be together. As you said, Minister Goyal and I have spent a lot of time over the last years trying to grow that relationship. We've had a number of conversations. He has become a friend. I'm proud to say he represents India very, very well. He's very smart and has I know he's has something to do with organizing the group. He's probably the organizer, but everybody who knows him he has sort of an infectious kind of a energy about him, and it's fun to be with him and fun to talk to him. And I think we have made headway. We had talked about doing a smallish GSP deal, but both of us really think that what's ultimately needed is a big deal. We need a large free trade-like agreement between the United States and India, and that'll cement this relationship in a way that other things won't. And that'll be good for the economics as well as the security, I think, of both countries, and help us two democracies write the rules for trade going forward. So I think that's very important. We have made headway. If you said, what are the barriers? The barriers, some are the same as they are with other countries getting together like this, and some are unique. India has extremely high tariffs, maybe the highest in the world. To give your, the people at the meeting here an idea, we, the United States, have all of our tariffs bound, and we're probably at a 3% level or something, depending on which way you calculate it. By contrast, India only has about 75% of their tariffs bound, and the bound rate is about 50%. So it's a very, very high rate for a country with a $2.8 trillion economy. And your effective rates, of course, are substantially lower than that, but they are still 5 times ours. So tariffs are a problem. Reducing tariffs on an MFN basis may be something India is not interested in. But if they had a deal with the United States, we could reduce tariffs in ways that would be helpful, I think, to both of us. Another thing that's true and it's an impediment in most deals that you do around the world, and that's agriculture. India has political issues with agriculture, like most countries do, and that, when I say most countries, I mean from Europe right on down the line, the United States and others. Agriculture is very sensitive in many countries, and I know it's particularly sensitive economically and also politically in India, but that's another issue. And then a third issue, I would say, if we're talking about sort of brand issues that we have to come to grips with, is the fact that India is famous for having a very strong bureaucracy. And since this is a confederation of Indian industries, I don't have to tell the Indian companies about this because they know it a hell of a lot better than I do. But there's a toughness and an independence about the bureaucracy, which makes reform in some areas more difficult than it probably ought to be. Having said all that, it's certainly that's something that's important. It's worth the effort. Hopefully, this will continue going forward. As I say, Minister Goyal and I made a lot of headway, and hopefully that direction will continue, because it's very important for our economies, but more importantly, it's important for our countries. And we have the vital thing, I should say, which is completely obvious, is that we have an awful lot of Indian Americans in the United States, right? It's one of our very large population groups, and you saw when the Prime Minister went to Texas and other places and gave these great speeches. It was one of the real great moments. I'm sure everybody has that vision in their mind when they think of it. The two of them together, it was like one of these crazy scenes. So, and I think that's a part of our rich tapestry that is the United States, and which will ultimately make it likely that we can get something done here. So, with that, why don't I stop talking and listen to your questions, and then any questions anyone else may have.
Sure. Thank you, Ambassador, for your remarks. I have a few questions which are with me, and so I'm going to start with that. So, you did talk about tariffs, but do you think India has opened up over the years on investments? Because we see a lot of US investments coming into India. And do you think that to some extent makes up for this tariff point that you're making?
No, I don't think it does at all. I think they're totally independent things. We have seen a growth in investment. That's good. We've seen a growth in trade. We have seen the trade deficit, however, persist. It's actually up from 18 to 19. Now, it'll be down in 20, but everything is kind of odd in 20, right? It's like the year from hell. So for all of us. But while trade has gone up dramatically in the last 5 or 6 years, the deficit has not really gone down. It's been about 29 or $30 billion right along, which is probably not a good idea. Investment has gone up. That's good. But no, if we're going to have a closer relationship economically, that means trade. And trade means buying as well as selling, right? So there's a lot of things that India could buy from the United States and doesn't because of very, very high tariffs. So no, I don't think the investment offsets the tariffs at all. I think India, it's an internal matter. To some extent, you fund your government more than other countries do by tariffs. We did that early on in our time in the United States. Now we got away from that with other kinds of taxes, primarily an income tax. But I think India has to come to grips, and that means the people listening here today, as political as well as business leaders, have to come to grips with the idea that you're going to have to reduce tariffs on an awful lot of things, or you're not going to have the kind of real close trade relationships you want with the United States and others. Clearly, there's room for India wants to develop its own industry in certain areas, and that's all understandable, and people have done that historically. But the United States can't have a relationship where one country has tariffs that are 5 or 6 times higher than theirs, and sometimes even higher than that, sometimes 100%, right, versus 2%. So that's something you're going to have to come to grips with if you actually want a relationship that's going to be closer and which I think is really good. So it's a political decision, a business decision people have to come to grips with. And I'm not saying no tariffs on anything, right? We have to be realistic. We all have our own politics. We all have our own security issues. But right now, I would say that's the biggest single issue you have is you have very, very high tariffs, really even higher than other developing countries.
So I have a more general question, more to do with world trade. Over the last few decades, the world trade has actually grown faster than GDP, apart from in the last few years. Now with geopolitical issues as well as the pandemic coming up, more and more people are talking of shorter value chains, purely from a risk perspective. So how do you see that impacting trade? Do you think trade is going to now slow down a bit compared to GDP, or do you see overall a structural shift in the way people look at global trade?
Well, I mean, our view, let me say, first of all, it's a complicated situation in the United States, what our view is. We have, just like India, we have a lot of different disparate views. The Trump administration views is that we ought to be manufacturing more in the United States and not have these very long supply chains. We've seen the vulnerability of long supply chains in this COVID situation. But that's just one example of it. I do believe you're going to see a trend in business to shorten supply chains, to manufacture more at home. I think you're clearly going to see that in the United States. People realize more than they did before, not just because of COVID, but I mean because of actions that we've taken and others have taken economically over the last 3 or 4 years, that there is a risk in that. And that manufacturing closer to home is a good idea. So I think you're going to see some trend in that direction, but for sure we have a global integrated global manufacturing, and I'm not suggesting for a second that's going to change. But I do think the business people that I talk to, I'm interested to hear from you. I'm the one, I guess, being interviewed. I'm interested to hear from you what you think. But I believe you're going to see at the margin a trend more towards shortening supply chains and manufacturing more at home.
Yeah,
and I guess that will reduce trade. Sorry.
Yeah, I think what has happened over the last few years is some of the extreme climatic events have also disrupted supply chains. We've seen that in the past, where flooding in one country or something else, or the earthquake in Japan, for instance, impacted the auto value chains. The floods in Thailand did that some years back. So we are seeing that companies are looking at their own risk appetite when they look at long supply chains and either working to diversify, and which brings me to my next question. diversify so that they are less dependent on one country or one supplier in one country. And two is people would like to get their supplies local, or more, localized. So you see auto companies having localization drives across different geographies that they're present in. So an opportunity that we see for India, and I want your views on that, is as people diversify supply chains, because India was not the preferred destination for a lot of manufacturing investment over the last maybe couple of decades, where it's gone to China or to Vietnam, more recently to Vietnam. So do you think India has, is a contender for investments when people look at diversifying out of China and Vietnam, or is there a lot more for us to do?
Well, I mean, when I look at it, once again, I'm a trade policy person rather than a business person, and that's your views on this are probably better than mine by a long shot, and most of the people listening. In my point of view, from my point of view, I would say yes, India for sure ought to be an alternative, certainly a competitor for China and Vietnam. It has a lot of advantages. It has some disadvantages, some of which I've just said, but it has some substantial advantages, right? It's got a large population. It's a large market. It's got a highly educated and energetic workforce. It's hard to see advantages that China has over India in all those areas. Now, where do they have advantages? They're more organized towards supporting those things, right? They have their own issues with their bureaucracy, as we all know. They've put a focus on it, but for sure there ought to be some trend, and that's one of the things that Minister Goyal and I have talked about. There ought to be some trend. If you had an agreement, a big agreement with the United States and India, I think you would see that shift in a way that's substantial.
The other question I had is a little bit more to do with the state governments in the US. Over the last few months, CII has had focused engagements with several US state governments who are keen to connect at a deeper level with India and the Indian business community. For instance, Virginia, California, North Carolina, South Carolina, Michigan, Maryland have been forthcoming to build stronger business linkages. So any advice for us as industry associations on how do we strengthen the cooperation both at the state and the regional level in addition to whatever we do at the national level?
Yeah, I couldn't quite get the drift of that question. There was some breakup. Is the question how do Indian companies come to the United States work with the states? Was that the nature? No. I couldn't quite get it.
Sure. The question was more the reverse, to say that we are working closely with some of the states who are looking also both ways, looking at India's destination as well as for Indian investments to come to those states. So any suggestions on how we can build on that beyond whatever we do at the national level?
Well, once again, I'm not particularly an expert on that. I know there is a lot of state-to-state contact there between Indian states and American states. We have a variety of facilitation agencies in the Department of Commerce which are helpful. That can be advised, but from my point of view, I don't have any specific ideas. I think as a general at the national level, it's something that we welcome that investment going back and forth. We do think it's really important for the United States and for our relationship. And the Commerce Department has some facilitation groups, but they're not anything that I.
Suchita, are you there? Somebody from CII? Have you lost the ambassador?
Yes, it looks like we just lost the connection or trying to reconnect.
Sorry, Ambassador, we lost you for a minute. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah, I lost you too. I felt alone in the world here, but now you're back. Now you're back. I
Yeah.
feel better.
So thank you. No, we were discussing how should we build relationship with the states, and you had your advice. Anything that you missed that you wanted to complete, or should I move on to the
Well,
next?
no, not really. I mean, the Department of Commerce has some ways to do that, and I have found that the states are quite open to investment, both going and coming, ours and yours, and hooking up with the right people is something that's not that difficult to do, and certainly to the extent that the USTR has anything, we're an agency also that's available to facilitate that. But for the most part, for us on our side, it's the Department of Commerce, and I think it's obviously as a funnel, it's Minister Goyal for you all.
So I have a question again from the audience. So the question is a comment and a question. Given the strong relationship between India and the US, it's time to further engage in trade, and both sides should work in a time-bound manner to finalize FTAs. This is more a suggestion and comment. So do you think we are anywhere close to a timeline, or you think it's still some distance away? And the following comment is innovate in USA and make in India for the world. So this was the comment.
I couldn't hear the second part of it.
The second part, which was more to say that if we have an FTA, we could innovate in the US and make in India for the world.
So, clearly we want to be in a position where we're bringing our economies closer together, as I said. In terms of how long it takes to do a deal, we have one deal which is, on the smaller side. My guess is we're not that far away from a deal like that. Now, keep in mind, obviously, we have a political change going on over here, and that's going to be a bit of a setback, certainly to the extent that I can facilitate that. I'd be happy to do it, but there's going to be some change, and my guess is that's going to slow things up. In terms of a major deal, the kind of deal that I know that your minister and our bosses would like, at least in concept, my guess is that's going to take a while. My guess is that's not going to be anything that happens anytime soon. But I think just working on it is helpful, right? It's one of those things that by engaging, you probably do help yourself. I know that India has been in lengthy negotiations with Europe. Similarly, they had the RCEP thing, which they broke away from. So, there's a history of these things taking a long period of time. But I think if there's real energy, you could get something together. It certainly is a natural for the United States and India to pull closer together.
Okay. So, since you're talking of trade agreements, the other question which has come is on the World Trade Organization. Seems to be in a bit of a state of inertia with no negotiations being held, and a dysfunctional dispute resolution mechanism, and a deadlock on the appointment of a new director general. The US has always been a strong pillar of support to the multilateral order and institutions, and we believe the US leadership is critical to inject much needed vigor into the WTO. So what, according to you, would be the best way to end this impasse on the WTO?
Well, I think, first of all, we have to realize that the WTO has really has some major problems. When we came in, the Trump administration had this view. Some others did too. It was a kind of a bipartisan view that there were problems at the WTO, and we focused on it. And I think a lot of other countries around the world realize that it is. So let's take a step back and think about it. So the WTO came into existence in 1995. Before that, we had the GATT. And you all, my recollection is kind of came into the GATT in the 1950s, maybe 1950, even fairly early on. It started in 47. You had 8 rather large rounds of negotiations culminating in the Uruguay round, which created the WTO. So you had a lot of active, vibrant negotiations, and these negotiations would go on for many years. So there was more or less continuous negotiations and movement towards rounds. So let's look at what's happened since 1995. And you've seen basically the opposite. You've seen no real rounds of negotiations at all. You had a Doha round, but it was sort of, stillborn, right? It never made any sense to anyone. It was a couple of people here and a couple of people in Europe deciding they were going to do a round, the purpose of which wasn't to help, it was really to help other countries develop rather than to help yourself develop, right? So the whole notion to me never made the slightest bit of damn sense. And so you had that. Nothing happened with it. You did have a trade facilitation agreement, but that's really not a trade negotiation, right? That's just like a bookkeeping kind of thing. So you ask yourself, why is it that we've now, after this great 1947 to 1995 period of constant negotiations and making real progress, why is it there's been nothing that's gone on? There are a lot of reasons for that. One is more people have gone into it, and it's a consensus kind of a group, and the more people you have in, the more trouble you have with the consensus. Another thing would be that you have China in the group, which is a very big influence over the WTO. But to me, another factor is this dispute settlement. Now, remember, we had dispute settlement before the WTO in 1995, but we didn't have binding dispute settlement. You would bring a case, and then you try to negotiate your way out of it, and that was, acceptable sometimes. Other times it wasn't, but, it was kind of, hit or miss. So they decided they would go to a binding dispute settlement. Now, maybe that makes sense. I know in your business, Tata Steel, when you do a situation, you have arbitration provisions and the like to make sure you have binding ways to resolve. I'm not as sure that's important between countries, but even if you decide it is, you would say, let's have a kind of one-tiered arbitration, and that'll resolve that issue between us. What the WTO has tended to do, and it's just because this is the way bureaucracies grow, is they've created this appellate body, which has become like something like a Supreme Court. It's basically not accountable. It makes rules that take away benefits from countries, I would suggest, and things that are negotiated, they don't recognize. Things that were never negotiated, they enforce. So it's been bad. So what's been the result of that? I would say two things. First of all, from the global point of view, people have tended to become litigators instead of negotiators. And so their view is, why would we bother to negotiate? We'll just litigate. We'll just keep bringing cases. And then from the point of view of the United States, we are, without question, the most open economy in the world, right? We have an $800 billion trade deficit, right? That's a pretty good indication that you're open, right? We have enormous amounts of trade, and more imports by far than anyone, just by far. And yet we've been sued more than anyone. I mean, we've been sued way more than anyone. We've been sued like 150 times. The next is like 80, right? I mean, we've been sued 5-6 times more than China. Right, it's crazy. Now, why is that? There's a lot of reasons. One, you're in the United States doing business, so you bring cases. There's been a lot of cases brought against our trade laws, which we negotiated in the WTO appellate body. I believe erroneously removed a lot of the things that we negotiated with and said, no, those don't count. They ignored the clear writing in the contract and just created a jurisprudence. And when you have 7 people doing that, it's going to create a problem. It's created a lot of animosity in the United States, a lot of animosity in this administration, but in the previous administration, right? And then the one before that. So the appellate body is a real problem. We haven't had negotiations. Even this most recent fisheries negotiation, which seems like sort of an obvious thing, you couldn't get off the ground because you had certain countries that just want to subsidize and overfish. We have, I'll give you another example. We have an example of this Airbus case, which has gone on in this appellate body context of this dispute for 15 years. And we're trying to resolve it, but I don't know whether we can resolve it. And the reason we can't resolve it is the Europeans want to subsidize their airplanes, right? So they don't want to have a deal that doesn't let them subsidize their airplanes. So the WTO is a real has a real need for reform. I think there's agreement on that. I think that there are steps that can be made. Hopefully people will take those steps. I do think it's necessary to have some kind of a body like this, right? It's an important thing to have, but it should be a place to negotiate, not a place to litigate. It's just, and it just has migrated from one to the other over a 25-year period. And it's also shouldn't be a place with a big, strong bureaucracy. We have enough trouble with bureaucracies in the United States and India. We don't need to have them in Geneva. So those are all the reasons why I think the WTO really is in need of reform. Hopefully it will reform. It's going to require people making compromises. But it has to get back to its core purpose, which is people negotiating to help trade, right? And it just hasn't done that to speak of in 25 years.
So you talked of fisheries, which brought to my mind the discussions between the EU and UK. Where do you see that? Any views on where it's headed? It seems to be going to the edge.
Well, I'm no more of an expert on the Brexit talks than any of us. Indeed, my goodness, you probably spend more time thinking about it than I do because you've got a big operation in the UK. I talked to my counterpart, Secretary of State Liz Truss, who is not doing that negotiation, right? She's has the misfortune of having to negotiate with me instead. But I do talk to her about it. I've always had this view that in the final analysis, there's too much trade not for them to have a deal, right? I mean, it's just an enormous amount of trade. It's like the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Eventually, we had to have some kind of a deal, right? There's just so much trade. We had, in our case, it's $1.4 trillion worth of trade, right? I mean, it's like by far the most of anywhere in the world. But it's still really, there's hundreds of billions of dollars of trade going back and forth. And it's been going back and forth for a long time. So it's hard for me to believe they don't ultimately have a deal. That's always been my view, but it's not based on inside information or particular insight into what their situation is. I mean, part of it, economically, it has to be. The thing that makes it tricky is politically. There are those in Europe who are upset that Britain lost or left, and they're and they think that others may leave, and so they want to be difficult. And I can understand that sentiment too. I may very well have the same sentiment, but the business people have so much at stake that and jobs. It's hard for me to believe they don't ultimately do it. And the other thing is, what big deal doesn't come down to the deadline, right? I mean, I've never done one, and I sure as hell bet you have never done one that didn't come down to the deadline. You look too shrewd for that. So my guess is it comes together, but once again, that's just a guess. I don't.
Great. I can't but help you ask a question on steel, which is typically in the middle of all trade discussions. So any comments? You must have watched the industry, and particularly in your discussions with China and everybody else. Any comments on the steel trade and whether it's fair, unfair? Any comments on that?
Well, as you know, I have a long background in steel, not as long as yours, but I have a long background. I've worried about steel for a long time. I mean, the fundamental problem with steel is that every country wants to have a steel industry because they think it's important basis for manufacturing in their country, and it's kind of like a necessary step to be towards development, right? And you know this as well as I do. You operate all over the world, and there are other Indian companies that do too. So, I mean, in the steel industry. So when you have a situation where all the politicians want to have a steel industry, you're going to end up with a hell of a lot of subsidies, a hell of a lot of overcapacity, and a hell of a lot of stuff directed for reasons unrelated to economic efficiency, right? And that's really what we have. And then you impose on that in the last few decades, at least 2 decades, 2.5 decades, China, which is, and I'm saying this not for your benefit, but for the benefit of others listening who aren't as close to this situation because you know it so intuitively. But China who decided they were not only going to have a steel industry, they were going to have like the biggest steel industry in the world. So to give people some frame of reference, the United States might produce, 90 or 100 million tons of steel. The capacity of the Chinese is probably 1.1 billion, right? I mean, they're like 11 times their capacity, and they're up the U.S. capacity, which is sort of staggering. And they have more excess capacity, the way we think of it, than the United States and Europe and several other countries have capacity. So that is and they're in a position where a lot of their companies don't have to make money all the time, right? They want to keep people employed. So I've always thought it was for those reasons, a really, really tough business. And I salute those of you that can do it and make a profit out of it, because it really is a tough business. On the other hand, it's an essential business, right? I mean, most of what we do, all of our buildings and our automobiles and our roads and everything else have large elements of steel. So it's very complicated. I used to say this in the 80s, when I was the deputy USTR in the Reagan administration, I used to say the biggest problems you have are steel and agriculture. And now here I am, an old man sitting in Washington, USTR, the Trump administration. I'm thinking, damn, we do have technology. We have a lot of other issues, but yeah, we still have the steel and agriculture to worry about.
No, that's true. I think that's why I asked this question, because geopolitically and trade-wise, it's always featuring in all conversations, which has a big impact on our industry. Every day when you open the papers, there's something in it which impacts you. When you look back at I'm sorry, I thought I lost you. When you look back at your last 3.5 years, anything that would you have done differently? Anything that you would have done differently? You reflect back on your last 3.5 years.
So, I am proud of what the Trump administration did, obviously, during these going on 4 years. As you say, we did the biggest trade deal in New York history, and that's the redo of NAFTA, and we made it different. We have a different objective, and it's a really high standards, good deal, the best deal. Trump has really done two things that are really, really important. One is he's reoriented trade policy in the United States more towards worrying about working people. It's not so much about corporations and globalism and chasing the last little bit of efficiency for a short-term benefit to some CEO in some company. It's not about that anymore. It's about workers and what effect does it have on workers, and a little bit of inefficiency if the result is better communities and stronger families and a better country is worth it. And I would think the Indians would think the same way, right? Now, you can go too far, and you end up, killing the goose that laid the golden egg if you're not careful. But just looking for rules and fighting battles to make it easier for people to outsource is the opposite of what we ought to do. And the president has really changed that paradigm substantially. The other thing I would say we have done is really call attention to the fact that there's a competition between state capitalism, particularly on a grand scale, like you see in China, and the kind of economy that we have and that you have and others. And there's a competition between those two. And there's a competition between their system and our system. When I say our, I mean the United States, but also India. There's a huge competition between those two. There's sort of a strategic competition, and it has a lot of lanes, right? There's cyber, and there's military, and there's economic, and we could go right down the line. And in the trade area particularly, he's brought attention to the fact that we have to have our system prevail, and that we shouldn't have a system. We have to be concerned about having free companies compete with state capitalism and accept the outcome as if it was market determined, right? It's kind of a notion that I think a lot more people are concerned about in the United States for sure, in both parties, but I think also in India and around the world. And I think that for a whole lot of reasons, including proximity, Prime Minister Modi and Minister Goyal and others have been leaders in this fight also. And I think this has been a very important part of what President Trump has done and what I've tried to do. So if I had to say two things, one, it would be kind of reorienting the purpose of trade policy and having it more focused on workers. And then this concern that we have to get rules right that work for us, as well as for people who engage in state capitalism. But we can't be in a position where we're running. I mean, we talk about our trade deficit with India, and we're annoyed by it, and we're annoyed by our trade deficit with Europe. But with China, we were running a $400 billion trade deficit. $400 billion, right? It's like hard to believe. It's just beyond imagination. And in many, many cases, it really wasn't a question of economic efficiency or market outcomes. It was a question of states directing resources in a way that made their people win and the other side lose. So, staying focused on that, I think really, really is important. I know India feels the same way. So, I mean, those are the two things that I'm proudest of, of what we've done. And as you say, we've done deals. We've done USMCA, which is the biggest deal ever. We did a great China Phase 1 deal, which we can talk a little bit about, which was really part of a strategy to confront the fact that we were basically in a trade competition and not participating particularly. So we set rules that'll protect intellectual property and technology transfer and financial services and other things. And for the most part, China is implementing those systemic changes, and they're good for everyone, not just the United States. We have tariffs to take away some of the unfair advantages they have in a whole variety of areas. And then we had a bunch of purchases. And it's written and it's enforceable. So I think it's a good agreement. That's another agreement. We had, as you say, one with Japan that was quite a large, good agreement. For us, at least, we got most of the benefit we would have gotten out of TPP because we have FTAs with most of the other TPP members anyway. So, and then we have, Korea, a deal with Korea. We have scores of other deals in the steel area, which I know you're very much aware of, but also in agriculture and a whole lot of things. We've done deals, smaller deals, but still significant deals with Indonesia, and I could just go right down the line. So we've been very busy. We've been very focused, and we've changed the nature of what we're about, and hopefully that'll last. That's I think the China awakening will last, and I'm very hopeful that the changing the direction of trade policy or the objective towards workers will also last.
So
it's one of the things. Remember, I'm sorry. I just say it's one of the things the president got reelected. The president got elected on this issue, and he ran on it. And it was interesting. The other side, Biden didn't really run against our views at all. Right? It was very interesting. And so it's an enduring part of the Trump legacy. Anyway, I apologize. I cut you off.
No, not that. I was coming to a question which was triggered by your comment. When you said the focus on workers, there is a view that trade has reduced inequalities between countries, but increased inequality within countries. Do you think that's true? I mean, when you say that you need to focus a bit more on the workers, even at the cost of efficiency.
The answer is, I think it can be true. Do I think it has to be true? No, but I think it can be true, and I think in many cases it is true. There's like two schools of thought we had. This is all pre-Trump, right? One school would be, let's do what the big corporations want, and we'll retrain the workers, right? So the notion is that we have 50% of our workforce doesn't have a college education. We're going to retrain them from making steel to programming computers, right? Well, we both know, or designing rocket ships. We both know that's not going to happen. So that was one view. The other view was we'll focus on the objectives of big corporations and we'll give money to the people who are left behind, right? We'll just have transfer payments and we'll pay these people off. Our view is that neither of those, the first one's not reasonable, and the second one ignores the intrinsic value to people that they're doing constructive work. And so we don't like either one of those. What we want is a policy that just doesn't create that kind of a difference. And if you said, has in many cases inequality within countries been the result of international trade, I would say yes, for sure. And that's something we have to be very careful about. And for the United States, the definition of the United States is a country with this enormous middle class, right? We define ourselves as the middle class. Now, we have a big income spectrum in that middle class, but we are a middle class country. That's what the United States is, and that's what it's always been, and it has to stay that way. It can't become a country of rich people and poor people, right? That's not a good outcome. And I know that a country like India, which is in the development stage, is very much concerned about growing people into the middle class. And I think that when you look at your trade policy, you have to be conscious of that. That's an objective.
You know, while talking of trade, and traditionally the discussions have been more about manufactured goods and things like that. But over the last 20, 30 years, with the growth of telecommunications, services has also got disaggregated, just like manufacturing has. And so the services component of trade is growing and is becoming more and more relevant. Over the last few years, we've seen technology become a very important point of discussion. So when you look at trade, how would you approach it differently, given that the configuration of trade is changing? You know, it's more knowledge intensive, more service intensive, and it's not just simple about goods.
Well, I mean, personally, I think that's a trend that's been going on for a long period of time. And if you look at what we've done, we've focused on digital trade and e-commerce and all these kinds of things. And I know there's a push in India for a number of companies to get more into this area. So we have pushed for the kinds of standards that we would expect in goods trade to apply in these other areas. But I think you have to be careful, at least in my judgment, that you not buy into this notion that you're somehow post-industrial, right? Because an awful lot of innovation in those good jobs also are, and even the services trade, a lot of it is services trade, but ultimately it leads to goods. So I don't buy the idea that we're going to be post-industrial, certainly not an economy the size of yours or the economy the size of ours. I can see how it could happen in a smaller country. But I mean, these are services jobs in those areas are good jobs, important jobs. We have to keep those jobs too in our countries and grow those jobs. So I don't want to in any way diminish that. But I think we can easily do both of those things. And I think with countries the size of ours and economies, now ours is obviously much bigger than yours, but yours is still big, right? I mean, $2.8 trillion is a pretty big economy. It's one of the, I don't know what it is, but it's certainly got to be one of the 7 or 8 biggest economies in the world. You have to be able to do both. You got to be able to nurture and take and have those industries grow, trade in those industries. That is to say, have rules in the United States so that we can sell to you and you can sell to us, but also do the same thing on the manufacturing front. I think maybe a few years ago, it was all too much of a feeling that, it's all going to be this futuristic stuff, the new economy and all that. And we have to focus on that, but we can't ignore the fact that we got agriculture and we have manufacturing and we have an awful lot of other things that we have to take care of that employ a lot of people and that are really important to having communities in our countries that are healthy and safe.
So, trade between India and the US moved from some 16 billion to about 150 billion last year. And if the ambition is to take it to 500 billion, I don't know over what time frame, what are the areas where you think that we should really work on? I mean, where there's an opportunity to grow trade many times over.
So yeah, I saw that $500 billion number. It seemed like an ambitious number. I had the same reaction to you. I wonder what time period we're talking about. Now we have seen like, I mean, I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I think trade has grown in the last 8 or 9 years from 100 billion to 150 billion. That's pretty good growth, right? As I say, we, from our point of view, are still troubled by the fact that the damn trade deficit stays around 29. Yeah, 29 or $30 billion a year. That's troubling to us. But the fact that trade is growing is, I think, helpful. And if you said what would do it, I think if you really wanted to grow that trade, you would do a deal. You would reduce your tariffs for the United States substantially in a variety of areas that were picked strategically. Look, none of them are going to be easy to cut because they're all there because somebody benefits from it, right? I mean, that's just the fact. Anytime you look at, you say, my God, why does India or any other country have a 30% tariff on something? You can usually trace it back to one guy who's sitting there thinking, damn, that makes me rich, right? That's just the fact. It's not necessarily in the interest of the workers, for sure. Sometimes it is, but usually not. It's usually in the interest of a few people, and it's a level of inefficiency that's not good. So if India cleverly and strategically reduce these tariffs for the United States in certain areas, you would see more of an integration. You'd see more sales for the United States in India, and then that would result in more sales from India to the United States. So I think that's something that can happen. It's a big job. It's going to require somebody taking a baseball bat to bureaucrats, and but I think it's something that in fact can happen and should happen. And I think in the final analysis, if it did happen, it would be good for both of us. So, hopefully that's something down the road. It's probably not going to be something that I'm going to get done. Piyush is younger than I am. Maybe he'll get it done. Hell, he's practically a child. So he's got lots of years to work on it.
So I have a question on Africa. That's a continent which China is obviously working very hard on. India is also looking at it. What's the U.S. view on the potential for trade? There is 1 billion people over the next few decades going to hopefully get richer.
Yeah, the numbers are staggering in Africa when you look at it. I mean, I can't remember what I looked at it the last time, but I mean, it's like more than 2 billion people in 20 years. I mean, it's like beyond an explosion. It's something that as you say, China's very active in it. My guess is China's going to wake up one day and say, God, we wasted a lot of money on stuff that never amounted to anything. But maybe not. Maybe I'm wrong on that. I know India's looking at it. Europe has gone around and has a variety of programs in a whole lot of areas. The United States has done this in a couple of ways. So one thing that I've done is started an FTA negotiation with Kenya. And my hope was that we could get that done and then have other countries join on and have an FTA relationship with a number of specific countries. It's difficult. It's complicated, right? Because they have a continental integration that's going on. They have the African Congress, which is complicated. They have a lot of subgroups, which is complicated. So it's very tricky for Kenya. But it's something we're making good headway on, and who knows what's going to happen with it now. But in addition to that, we have something called the African Growth and Opportunity. What do we call a growth and opportunity agency? So we basically give duty-free access to most of Africa right now. I mean, and it's complicated. They have to do certain things, and it doesn't apply to everything, and the like. But this. Makes it complicated for us to get much done, right? Because we're already kind of giving away what we would normally trade, and it's a program I think is going to expire soon. And then my hope is that at that time the United States begins to do more traditional kind of FTAs with African countries, and I think there's real hope there. I think it'd be good for Africa. I think it'd be good for the United States. There are a lot of very forward-looking leaders there trying to get this on. One of them is President Kenyatta, right, who's nearing the end of his tenure, but is a forward-looking guy there in Kenya and really trying to get it done. There's several others who are also that really. if we take a step back and talk about something we talked about before, and that is this competition between what you and I would say is the way economies should be organized and the state capitalism approach, that competition is going to play out in Africa. And I think an awful lot of African leaders want to come our way, right? They want to do it the way that history would tell you is more likely to be successful. So it's going to be interesting to watch over the next several years. There's just a million different things going on. Everyone's in there. Everyone has the kind of idea that we want to somehow get involved with Africa, and Africa's going to sort out its own future. But clearly, there's going to be one thing's for absolute sure. There's going to be a hell of a lot of people there. Right now, how big the economy is or whatever, I don't know, but there's going to be a lot of people in Africa before too long. There are a lot now, there's going to be a lot before too long.
And a lot of young people. I mean, demographically, they're very young, younger than India.
Yeah. They actually are. I mean, my sense is they're the youngest in the world, right? I mean, I think that's right.
Absolutely. I know, Ambassador, we're running out of time. I really appreciate the time you spent with us. Thank you for joining us and sharing your thoughts very openly. We're glad that you took this time out for us. The India-US trade and commercial partnership, I'm sure, will continue to grow stronger. We've heard you, and I think there's work for us to do. And I think I just want to share with you, CII did some studies prior to the pandemic and found that, both ways, US firms are bullish or moderately bullish on India's overall economic outlook. And similarly, Indian firms who had invested in the US were also optimistic about the shared vision for a closer and a greater future. Thank you very much for your time with us. Really appreciate that on behalf of CII and on behalf of everyone who's logged in to hear you. Thank you so much. Appreciate
it.
Thank
you very much, Mr. Narendra. I enjoyed this conversation very much. I look forward to visiting India before too long as a private citizen, and I've decided I'm going to allow my friend to buy me dinner when I get over there. So I'm just giving him notice right now, and I hope everyone has a great end of this year and a great 2021. So I wish the best to all your industries.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, and wish you all the very best. Thank you.
Okay.
We can go off broadcast now.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador Leitesser. Thank you, Mr. Narendran.
Pleasure.
That was a really good session. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.